My name's Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Knowledge Hub, and I'm talking today to Jonathan Kraft, who is currently a project manager within APQC's advisory service group. Over the past 7 years, he's worked in advisory services and the research services group within APQC. And for the last 4 years, Jonathan has been managing process improvement and knowledge management projects for APQC's advisory services team. Before that, he spent 4 years as a benchmarking practice lead for a tax consulting firm, and also 5 years at the Hackett Group in both service delivery and business development. So, Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
We were just talking. I came across you because of the post, the blog post that you set up on knowledge mapping, and really that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. And I wanted you to give me just an introduction. What is this concept of knowledge mapping, and how does it work?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to do so. So knowledge mapping is a technique that we actually do a lot of work on and with for our clients at APQC. But the design is to say, in order for any organization to work, as we were just chatting, the knowledge has to flow within the organization. And the knowledge map is very similar to any type of map that you would use today, whether you use I'm old enough that I can remember using a paper map and my dad handing me an atlas and saying, hey, this is where we are and this is where we're going, find it, to using a GPS in your car on your telephone. But the knowledge map is a tool that's really there to design to say, where does knowledge exist within our organization? And then where are there gaps where that knowledge exists? And those gaps can be anything from a individual gap to, as an individual, like a personal gap, to anything from there's a training gap that we're missing, or there's even a technology gap component that we're missing. And then the map is then designed to say, where are those biggest gaps, and what can we as a company do to try and close those gaps? So the knowledge map is just like any other map. It's where are we, where do we need to be, and how do we potentially get there? The knowledge map is just to say what knowledge exists within our organization or does not exist within our organization that we need to make sure we're capturing.
Right, and that would look, what would that look like? Would it look like a kind of mind map, or what would it look like?
Sure, that's a great question. For us, just because it's easy and everybody has this tool, we just use Excel. And the design behind that is, if you can picture an Excel spreadsheet, on the left-hand side, you'd have the knowledge that you're looking for, whether it's a process or an activity or that type of thing. And then the columns across the top are really things like, well, where does this knowledge exist? Does it exist in somebody's head? Does it exist in a repository? Is it a document within somebody's desk? And then everything else to turn to say, who can validate this data? Is that knowledge explicit in that it's easy to gather, it's like an instructional booklet, or is it tacit in that it actually exists in somebody's head, and we might need to interview that person. We might need to understand more about that knowledge. And then after that, we really do more of a ranking system in terms of, is there risk around this knowledge? And we usually typically do like a 1 through 5 gap. 1 being no risk, 5 being some type of risk, and we'll do some type of risk associated with that knowledge, and we'll do some type of color coding. 5 is obviously red, 1s are the greens, and 3 might be a yellow. But as you start to fill out that Excel spreadsheet, and some of them get pretty long, you can quickly look at the colors and say, we have gaps around this type of knowledge. And so then we can go out and actually start to identify, how do we close that gap? So that's typically what it looks like for us, Jonathan, if that helps.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And you talked about risk and risk associated with the knowledge. Is that risk because there's a gap in the knowledge? Is that a risk because the knowledge is commercially confidential and might leak out? What form does risk take?
Yeah, and that's a great question. There are all types of risks. So some of it is obviously maybe it's confidential, proprietary, based upon what the organization is doing. A lot of the risk actually is around two big elements. One is a person or individuals. So I sometimes call them knowledge hoarders, and those are the individuals that they capture that knowledge and they don't necessarily want to share that knowledge with other people because that makes them important, it makes them popular, it makes them what they think is valuable to the organization. So they like to kind of hoard that knowledge. So that's a big risk, because if that person were to leave the company the next day and all of that knowledge walks out the door, That's a big challenge. So that's one of the big risks. The other one is really the risk around the location of that knowledge. So I don't necessarily mean just specifically in somebody's head, which again is a big risk, like I mentioned, but also a lot of times organizations will say, specifically around the knowledge that we work with is, oh, we've done some type of process map, or we've documented that. And the follow-up question is, oh, that's great. Where is it? Well, it's on somebody's laptop, or it's in somebody's desk, or, or we ask, can we get access to it? And there's that hesitation. So the other risk is the location of it, and when is it updated? How frequently is it updated? How is it used? All of that type. So those are two of the big risks that we come up with. But again, another one that we come up with is really around what's the complexity of that knowledge, or the complexity of that step. Is it happening so often that, in order to get widgets out the door, this thing happens 1,000 times every day? We need to make sure that is running really well. At the other end of the spectrum is this happens once a year, and the only person that knows how to do that is Jim. And if Jim leaves, or we lose Jim, there's some knowledge risk around that as well. So I kind of hope that answers your question a little bit, Jonathan.
Yeah, really good. And if I worked for an organization that wanted to start this process, I'm guessing that you wouldn't do this in isolation. So you'd start with the organizational strategy, and you'd look at the capabilities required and the knowledge associated with achieving that strategy. But in practical terms, how might you sit down and start building a knowledge map?
Sure, and that's a great question. There's typically three types of knowledge maps that we look at. We look at an enterprise knowledge map, so everything across the function, so strategy, IT, finance, to some of their core business operations as well. Sometimes we look at a multifunctional knowledge map, or kind of an end-to-end process. So something like in the United States, purchase to pay, or procure to pay, retire, hire to retire, something like that. And then we also look at them specifically within like a single process. What does payroll look like in an organization? So there's three ways that you can look at it. So enterprise, end-to-end, or a single process. But the steps for doing that are really the same. The design is to say, let's identify what key process or processes we want to look at. Let's understand so you've identified the scope, then let's understand how can we collect that data. And that collection is really that Excel spreadsheet that I said that we use earlier that says, this is the process, this is where the knowledge exists, this is explicit or tacit information, that type of thing. And that data collection process is really the most difficult, because you're trying to gather this information, and you're really trying to say to other individuals, does a knowledge gap exist, or where does it exist? And sometimes it's hard for people to say, yes, we do have a challenge around that. So scope, collect, and then really the analysis of that, as I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation. Once you have all that data, looking at the reds, the yellows, and the greens of your sheet, if you use Excel, and saying, where are these gaps? And if you have a bunch of 5s or reds that you need to take action on, then really prioritizing those and saying, these are areas that we can go after. We can start to close that knowledge gap, and implementing a training plan, or maybe it's a technology plan or a communication plan, to start to close some of those gaps. And the beauty of anything, whether it's process improvement, whether it's knowledge management, is kind of once you're finished with that aspect of it, you have to refresh those maps. You have to go back and do this again, or else it becomes very one of those static items, like I mentioned earlier, that says, oh, we did a knowledge map once, but it was 5 years ago. And well, then you ask, has anything changed? Oh yeah, a lot's changed. We're no longer in that business, or whatever the case may be. So you have to update those knowledge maps. So I think that's the process at a very high level, but I think that was kind of where you were headed.
Yeah, I'm guessing that you could certainly identify the status of knowledge, and I guess the speed at which knowledge is changing. So as you're gathering knowledge, there may be some knowledge that you could be confident will be fairly static for 6 months or a year, and other knowledge is fast moving. And who typically would own this process? Would that be the project or program management office? Would that be some other knowledge function within the business?
And that's a great question. And that's the beauty of some of the work that we do, is it varies across every organization. It kind of depends. But to give you an idea, a lot of the times we will see the knowledge management group specifically report up into, sometimes it's the chief information officer. Sometimes that knowledge management group will actually report up to kind of an operations group, somebody that handles everything from IT to maybe finance and HR that all report up to that. And then sometimes we find that some of those leading organizations that really are very knowledge intensive organizations, either very technical or do have some proprietary information that they want to try and make sure they capture and keep that intellectual property, will actually have what we call a chief knowledge officer, so a CKO, that would report to an executive within the organization and have equal, have a seat at the table, is sometimes how we say it, so that they're in the same order of a chief financial officer or a VP of HR or that type of activity. So they sit in a variety of roles within the organization, but they all have the design of making sure that knowledge flows through the organization.
Right, excellent. I mean, at the moment we've been talking really about, I think, a single organization, even quite a big organization and enterprise, but a lot of projects these days are collaborative ventures. They involve extended supply chains. Have you seen this approach used to extend beyond the organizational firewall to say, actually, there's knowledge that is part of our process that belongs to one of our suppliers or that belongs to an alliance partner?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and you're right. In the world that we live today, nothing happens within just the four walls of the organization. And so typically what we see is we'll see that knowledge map will absolutely reference a supplier or a partner or that type of thing, because there's knowledge about that partner as well, right? So typically we will not see a knowledge map necessarily extend out the four walls, but we'll see the knowledge that is required to manage that partner, to engage with that partner, to understand what that partner is or is not delivering, really starts to get into that type of conversation. And when we start to see that activity happening, a lot of the times we'll actually transition to maybe a different tool that we call, is called a SIPOC. And maybe you're very familiar with the SIPOC, but it's another tool, again, that happens in Excel, but what it really stands is for your, if you think about it left to right, it stands for your supplier, your input, the process that is required to be done, then your output and your customer. And that gives you that end-to-end view from the supplier information comes in the door to our customer, which may be internal and external, and then all of the knowledge associated with that. So that's another tool that we use, maybe sometimes in addition to a knowledge map, to really look at that end-to-end process, Jonathan.
So would that bring together a knowledge map and a process map?
It's very similar, actually. It does, and so a lot of the times for processes that we work with, those key 5 to 10 maybe end-to-end processes that really exist within an organization that drive revenue and are strategic to the organization, we'll typically see a process map, a knowledge map, and then some type of either SIPOC map, which is that supplier, input, process, output, customer, or even a RACI chart, which you may be familiar with, the RACI chart, or RASCI, however it's used, and see those 5 documents kind of work in conjunction to say, if we ever have a problem with this process or need some input on this process, this is our process Bible.
Yes, yes. And what about informal knowledge? One of the things that I'm particularly interested in are things like knowledge cafes or randomized coffee trials, where there's an opportunity to expose knowledge that was kind of unconscious and hidden within the organization, and that really only emerges through serendipity or through some process to kind of trigger it.
Sure, and you're right. That, I think that knowledge is some of the most difficult knowledge to capture in any type of organization, because you're right. It's the coffee conversations or the water cooler conversations or the conversations that have been over cubicle walls. There's a lot of knowledge there. So the hope is a couple things. The hope is that as you're doing a defined knowledge map around specific processes, that you're engaging those type of people in the knowledge map creation. The knowledge map creation isn't just for the chief knowledge officer and team to do. They actually go out into the business and they interview and they have conversations and they fill that knowledge map out with the team, which is maybe a point I should have made earlier, so that if you and I did sit on different sides of the cubicle wall, which would be confusing for people. Hey, Jonathan, and we both look up. But if we did look on, if we were on different sides, and you and I were having a knowledge-intensive conversation, we want to make sure that we're involved in the creation of that knowledge map, so that we're capturing that. So we're capturing that type of information.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, the creation of the map and the conversations around it are all part of the knowledge management strategy. It's clearly not just about capturing data. I mean, you talked about tacit knowledge and things like this. It's not just about capturing data on Excel spreadsheets. It's about people's awareness of knowledge and their understanding of knowledge. So
Yeah, absolutely. And the other part that I really like about the knowledge map is there's a whole validation process that we go through at the end to say, is this accurate? And we're not looking for accuracy at 100%. Is this an 80 to 85% accurate most of the time, so that we can, again, we've confirmed this knowledge, we've validated this knowledge, we have an idea of everything from where that knowledge exists to the rankings, so that we can then go in, and whether it's APQC, another firm, or even an internal firm, can start to stack rank those and say, where are biggest areas of opportunity? But that validation plays an important part of that.
Right. So looking ahead, I don't know, 5 years is probably quite a long time in technology and knowledge terms. How do you see this developing?
I continue to see from a techniques perspective, I think the technique will continue to be very similar, and the process that the organizations go through. What I really see from a general knowledge perspective is a lot of the knowledge that is tacit today becoming more explicit. And I think that's the goal of any time you're trying to do this, is there's always a new technology or a new type of knowledge that needs to be aware. So I'm hoping what we continue to see is the information that exists in people's heads that is hard to gather and replicate becomes easier to replicate through whatever that process is, to get it out of somebody's head and into more explicit, some explicit format, and those leading, we call them nexperts sometimes, like the next experts, and seeing those individuals gathering new tacit knowledge and continuing to and kind of continuing the trend. So I don't know if I necessarily see a big shift. I just see different types of knowledge and making sure we're pulling all of what we can from a tacit format into more explicit format, so it's easy to be consumed. And I think the internet is driving a lot of that. I think some of the way in which information is shared, everything from how individuals engage based upon, are they a generation X or a generation Y, and how they like to actually consume information. I think that's how they consume it, and the manner in which they consume it, I think, is going to be the biggest shift.